Hello, good afternoon, and thank you all for coming. Excited to have you here for this webinar, and may introduce my co-panelists in just a moment, or let them introduce themselves. But before we get started, just want to start this off with a disclaimer, which is the views and opinions expressed in this webinar are those of the speakers and do not necessarily reflect the official policy or position of their respective organizations or any affiliated entities. This presentation is for informational purposes only and should not be considered as legal, financial, or regulatory advice. Additionally, no part of this webinar constitutes a recommendation or endorsement of any specific product, service, or strategy. Attendees should consult their own advisors before making any decisions based on the content discussed here today. So with that said, start off introducing myself. So I'm Jacob Kane. I'm the head of cybersecurity risk services here at Salus GRC, a regulatory compliance and cybersecurity firm servicing hundreds of investment advisors around the country, but based here in New York City. And with me over here to my right, Bill Saltis.
Hi, Bill Saltis. I am on the Morgan Stanley Prime Brokerage Consulting team. We help hedge funds of all sizes with all manner of things. These days, AI is one of those things, or as many of those things. So excited to talk about our recent experiences in that regard today.
Awesome. And then over from our regulatory compliance business, we have Ariana Monchik with us.
Hello, I'm Ariana. I have been doing this fun compliance stuff for about 20 years. I have been consulting for about 7 years now, but the majority of my career was spent in-house as a chief compliance officer for both mid and large size investment advisors, primarily in the wealth management space.
I'm EJ Yurzak, Managing Director at Salus GRC. My background is in legal, compliance, and cybersecurity. Been able to use both skill sets really to support our clients here on the compliance side and on the cybersecurity side. So AI is a very exciting topic, and happy to be here.
Great. So thank you, everyone. And just to set the agenda for today, we're going to be covering a handful of topics: AI use cases for investment managers, business, legal, and vendor risks, governance best practices, and obviously we can't let things go without the compliance side, SEC exam priorities, and regulatory expectations. So before we get rolling here, just want to get a sense for people out there in the audience, really what people are doing today. So our first polling question here is, are people using a general AI tool such as ChatGPT or Copilot or others? And while people are putting in their answers and letting us know, Bill, what are you seeing out there? You obviously talk to a great cross section of funds.
Yeah, so maybe I'll position it. That's always the challenge, right? When you say cross section is funds ranging in size from AUM a few hundred million and a dozen or so employees to billions and dozens of employees. And so the way that AI, broadly speaking, is being utilized or is beginning to be utilized within the community is, and I think the first question speaks to this a little bit. Look, existing platforms that incorporate it into the stack, right? So Copilot is sort of the example of that, the main example of that. I'm on a pilot use case at Morgan Stanley and just trying to figure out what it can do and what it can't do well. Things like managing calendars and things you think would be a home run, and instead it's incredibly difficult. But then you have other firms that have really kind of piled on and built and we'll get more of this later in the webinar, right? So this is just to sort of tee it up. Vendors that have built specific products with AI in mind from scratch to answer, I call it point solutions, right? To answer specific questions or perform specific tasks. Then we see platforms that have a little bit of a technology presence at my firm, but maybe not 20 people in IT, I might lean on a provider to provide the scaffolding to plug in an LLM or various LLMs, as well as to integrate other firms and then deal with some of the compliance issues and questions around capturing prompts, et cetera. And the largest hedge funds, right? Because even a large hedge fund is a small organization, really. But the ones that have robust technology and other functions are kind of directly procuring LLMs, having their developers build out the scaffolding with a combination of open source and vendor products, and building out the use cases kind of one by one. So again, it does run the gamut, but literally from small to large, there's different ways that funds are attacking it.
Awesome. Well, let's see. So it's a pretty good and even mix here. So amongst our audience, right, almost half of respondents here with ChatGPT, significant amount of Copilot. Again, only less than a third aren't doing anything today. So,
but even that, it's not 10%, it's not 8%. It's still almost a third that aren't doing anything just yet, but they're on this call, so they're curious.
Exactly. And one of those questions we often have when we get into organizations is are they really not doing anything today, or just not anything officially sanctioned or covered? As we go into organizations dig deeper, we find that most of the time that no answer means
you don't,
a few
not that you're aware
out
of.
on their own.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, which is a problem. Yeah.
And are doing that. And to kind of set the frame of where we are talking about different types of artificial intelligence, because artificial intelligence obviously is not new. But in the past, a lot of that's really been predictive AI. So that's more the traditional modeling, right? Leveraging data analysis to make predictions or models. So weather forecasting, portfolio modeling, things on that side. And some of it goes back a while, and partially why we asked our colleague Ariana to join us today is, she has experience going back quite a ways of working with that predictive AI side in the real world. And Ariana, maybe you could just share a little bit, on that side of where your experiences were.
Yeah, sure. I worked for a mid-size investment advisor that used a neural network starting back in the early 90s to help them make investment decisions. They served smaller account sizes. It was a retail RIA. And I think it's a good example of how AI can add value to a business. The neural network used algorithms to sift through market data, to identify patterns, and then produce information on the relative strength of different asset classes. And then the output from the neural network was used by the investment committee to produce model portfolios and asset allocation recommendations. The firm had, I think, about 30,000 accounts at that time. And so it allowed them to be able to provide investment management to smaller account sizes in a more efficient and profitable way. And I think also in turn service a larger portion of that market. They also used the neural network to test out new models. So it allowed them to test out an investment strategy to see if it would have been profitable. And so I think there was a lot of value for the firm in that regard. For me, being the chief compliance officer, I can tell you it was a bit overwhelming. I am not a tech expert. I know what I know, and I know what I don't know. And when I joined the firm in 2007, I recall asking the CEO how the SEC has felt about this going through exams. And he said they don't understand it. And that provided me a little bit of relief until the CCO liability cases started to come out. And that, of course, got my blood pressure up. And, I went into the CEO and CIO's office and said, I need to, understand this network better and the technology better and have more oversight. And so I think that is a challenge that we're seeing in the industry for a lot of chief compliance officers, both understanding how this works and then thinking through like marketing of it as well. We're going to talk, I think, a little bit more about that. That was something that was a challenge for me because we did market the neural network heavily, as well as performance of the models that relied on the neural network rankings. And then, of course, I went through also some SEC examinations, which I'll share more later in this presentation, in how I approached having these discussions with the SEC, because that was also a bit of a challenge. So it was, they were early adopters of it, but I think that it certainly added a lot of value to the business.
Yeah, it sounds like you were at the bleeding edge of that, and that experience will come in handy in 2025 and beyond, right?
Mm-hmm. Definitely.
Yeah, I think it's interesting to see how AI has evolved over the years. Predictive AI, Jacob, you mentioned some very early use cases, weather prediction, just being able to take past occurrences of data and make predictions about what is likely to occur in the future. Ariana, you mentioned some good examples about using predictive AI for investment recommendations. We've seen an evolution as computing power has increased, as specially designed computer chips have been created, that the powers of AI just keep getting better and better over time. And we've seen an evolution now towards generative AI, which is this other category. Early cases of Gen AI would be, think of chatbots. Think of you type text, you get a response. And I don't know if anyone remembers, but the early chatbots, you would ask them questions, but if the second you started veering off script, chatbots didn't know how to recognize that, and you'd often get some nonsensical answers. ChatGPT is an example of how generative AI has evolved to the point of being almost indistinguishable from human text interaction. And so when you think of AI, think of these two sort of general buckets: predictive AI and generative AI. Gen AI is essentially pattern recognition on steroids. It's pattern recognition being applied to be able to use past experiences, past patterns of text, images, video, any kind of inputs really, to generate novel content and derivative works from that.
Yeah, and I think part of where that change is critical is it's also able to generalize to more different use cases, right? Predictive AI tended to be something where it was coded more towards a specific use case or those areas, and where we're seeing that huge change with generative AI is it's really unleashed for different types of content, right? Different outputs. It could be voice, text, et cetera, but also really different types of use cases.
Yeah, the LLM is the reasoning part of it, right? So everything in the internet that it feeds the LLM, that's the thing that makes it be able to understand what Jacob's trying to ask it. And there could be data in there that it's referencing as well, but it's the power of its ability to reason with whatever you're feeding it. Hey, go analyze this document that I'm feeding you. Or maybe I have a more complex implementation with a vector database, and I have my whole corpus of data over here, and I can say, go look over here and pull that in and get me an answer. That's the difference, is that it is just a much broader application is a main difference.
Yeah, so I think, as we look through, and we're going to talk a little bit about the use cases and things that we see, going out there to again, ask our audience with the next polling questions, which is, how are you using AI tools in the following business areas? Let us know. We're very curious to see what you're using.
Yeah, I'll lead the witness here while everyone on the call is answering that question, right? But what we are seeing from a consulting perspective, right? When you think about the functions of a hedge fund, right, and kind of the functional model, research, marketing, tech, operations, legal, compliance, it could be others, right? But just breaking the world into that basic sort of framework, clearly, or not clearly, it's the majority of funds maybe that we speak to are most interested in attacking the research question. I mean, it's a perfect sort of search and summarize use case is, can you look at my research and draw sentiment analysis from it, right? Not new concepts, right? I think with alt data going back 8 years, alternative data, there was a push to do this kind of thing. There's just such a great ability to do this with greater scale, I think now. From a search and summarize perspective, I had one CTO tell me that what they did on top of their proprietary RMS allowed for an analyst who used to cover 15 names now cover 20 or 25 names, right? So if every analyst can be 40% more productive or 30% more productive, in the front office, efficiency equals alpha, right? So I'm covering more names, I'm casting a broader net, and that is going to get funded, right, from the management team. Then we can get into kind of costs and how they're declining. And Amazon's announcement last night, the cost of this technology is decreasing on a cycle basis. Research, there's some obvious things, right? Earnings call, search and summary, macro event call, transcription and analysis, some platforms that tap into Edgar Online and get financial information off of 10Qs, 10Ks, et cetera. Marketing perspective, I'll try to fly through a few, right? Generating a quarter letter and doing some review from a compliance perspective to see how it kind of fares relative to the marketing rule. DDQ platforms that now have AI, so I can look at a bank of past questions and answers to fill out the 10th one of these that I have to fill out. Technology, obviously GitHub Copilot and some competitors. Poolside.ai is one that comes to mind that can help coders learn new languages quickly and try to harmonize and standardize development across a technology organization. Operations, there's kind of some emerging use cases around reconciliation of more complex asset classes, loans, et cetera. And then legal compliance, right? So good way to bring it back to the other panelists. But we have seen vendors that can pull terms out of a contract and compare them across multiple counterparties and or vendors and track all that over time and just query that information. So there used to be a team of junior legal analysts doing this grunt work, and now there's firms out there that are using AI to do that. So those are some things that come to mind from a functional architect.
Yeah, and we're definitely seeing some of the more what are called grunt work side of the legal and compliance, not to put it down, but also areas where AI is coming in for areas such as e-coms review or first level marketing reviews. But I think that's still really in its infancy, and we're seeing some useful things there, but probably some limitations as well. Ariana, I don't know if you could speak to that a little.
Yeah, sure. And I just want to add too, because I know that it was about 20% or so of firms that said they're not using AI. And I guess the question I'd like to pose to you, are you using any service providers that might be using AI? Because a lot of service providers now are rolling out an AI component. And so we're going to talk a little bit more about, governance and all of that. But I think it's important to kind of understand, even if you're not using it internally at the firm, whether your service providers have added on an AI component to any of the technology or software that you're utilizing. But
it's a great point.
Jake, yeah.
Sorry,
yeah.
real quick there. 15 years ago, managers and others were apprehensive about the cloud, right? I'm not using the cloud, everything's on-prem. Do you have a prime broker or an admin or a bank, and do you hit their website and get all your reports from that website? Well, that's using the cloud through a service provider, right? So
yeah.
Eventually we all understood and got comfortable with it. So.
And I think the comfort level, I kind of talked about that a little bit already, but I think being a former compliance officer, a lot of compliance professionals that I speak to are very reluctant or feel overwhelmed about the use of AI and how they're going to tackle it. But there are a lot of tools to help compliance folks with oversight and supervision, like Jacob, you just mentioned, with whether it be e-com surveillance, marketing reviews. So I'm a big believer of embracing this technology and seeing how it can add value to your compliance program.
Awesome. Well, let's see what people are using it for so far. Interesting there. Leading the way, not surprising there, and heavy adoption on the technology side, but fairly broad across the marketing operations. So I'm assuming that a lot of people are using it in multiple areas of their business.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like tech is the most the thing that works best, right? At this point, right? Its ability to understand code is fairly advanced relative to some of the other functions. So I think that's why tech is so highly utilized.
Yeah, and it's
well,
funny.
It's interesting to point out too, Jacob, that and this sort of leads into what Bill was mentioning. 20 to 30% of our respondents indicated that they're not currently using AI, but I would take that question a step further and say, well, is it possible that your firm is using AI either through maybe some new hires that are willing to experiment with some of the newer technology, or to Bill's point, are there certain service providers that maybe you are using that are using AI under the hood, and perhaps that percentage is much lower in terms of firms that are completely not using AI?
And that'll get to the governance coming up, right? Which is you may have exposure there that you don't realize, and so taking a step back and as a firm figuring out how to attack it and systematize it, just from a pure governance and committee perspective, is really important to that point, EJ.
Yes, absolutely.
And I think one of the things where, when I talk to clients who are looking at, where can we start using it in our business, and this is a rapidly changing, even putting this section in here at the bottom of it. I feel like 6 months ago, we used to just sort of say, most of the time it's serving that role of an analyst.
Yeah.
Now it's serving that role of a really smart analyst. Friends of mine who are dealing with AI more intensively will say, more advanced situations, they really move beyond that model. But a lot of times people are starting with those more repetitive tasks or simpler elements and building up from there.
Yeah, that's a great point.
So as we talk about some of the key risks and different areas to work through, the number one thing we always get asked about is confidentiality. So across every use case, it's, that's almost always that first question, right? It's the confidentiality of where's my data going? Where is it stored? Is it going to be used to train a model, right? Where that might be able to be used by other people? Is that data cached somewhere where it's off-site? But even just, are the prompts that I use, that type of information, how is that staying secure?
Yeah, I'll jump in first. And sort of, I'm debating how much to say for the governance section, but I think it's appropriate to outline the risks, and then it'll be very apparent when we get to the punchline of all this. This is an attempt to mitigate the risks via better governance. So a couple things come to mind, and EJ is going to address some of the things you said about prompts and how to think about capturing the prompts from perspective. But I will start with a couple concepts. One being just data protection, and if you think about your current setup in, let's just say, the Microsoft environment and Entra IDs, formerly Active Directory, and Jacob can see this file, Bill cannot see this folder, et cetera. If I just take all my data in the firm and dump it into an AI environment, now any of us can chat and query that and get out sensitive HR information, salary and health maybe related information. And so there just needs to be obviously thoughtful controls around AI that hopefully you have within the firm in your overall, kind of file entitlements, application entitlement sort of framework. So that's one thing that comes to mind. Another thing that I'll hit real quick is this concept of a lot of mention gets made to like 0-day retention, right? If you're going to use ChatGPT, go get an enterprise license to get 0-day retention. Well, I think you need like 250 licenses, to have that kind of arrangement with OpenAI, and that's not going to be 99.6% of our hedge fund clients, right? And so they will say, well, it's 30-day retention, and it's so that we can kind of go back and audit for abuse, right? And then in 30 days. But you want to kind of go in this incognito mode, right? Which is sort of borrowing a term from our days of, learning how to use the internet, where, hey, don't train the model on my data, right? So from a risk perspective, understand that your data is, getting out there, but configuring it in such a way that the model's not going to be trained, so that the next user at another firm can't ask about, hey, what's Bill and Jacob, co-doing with regard to like this investment or that investment. So data, right? I think is risk number one, and there's a lot of different vectors of that. And I've touched on maybe two of them, but just to start there.
Yeah, and I think as you look through those, bringing up that with ChatGPT, there are a similar set of considerations with other tools and some particular. So in the Microsoft Copilot world, there's enterprise data protection, which are a set of features that can give you privacy around your data and around those prompts, and that's important. And particularly as you talk about turning the model on your data and those permissions,
Yeah.
I mean, those risks are there with every single application, every single model, right? But it is really dependent a lot on what you're giving that AI access to. So sometimes people are using more specialized tools and using ChatGPT, only giving it access to the data. We do see a lot in particular with Copilot because it's so easy to say with that integration, right? To say, have at it, take a look at my SharePoint, and that's people's primary file structure. That without those permissions and set through, right? Then you get people querying, right? How much does Bill Saltis make? What was his bonus last year?
Yeah, there's a lot of work. That's just another common theme, right? Before you get into any of this, if your data is completely disorganized, then you're gonna have a hard time getting anything useful out of AI, right? So the better your file structure is, and you've kind of tagged and indexed your data, be it on a document level or like a cellular level, the easier the time that the AI tools are going to have. So,
and then one of the other things that we get asked about a lot is that communications capture and the regulatory and legal risk side. And EJ, maybe you can speak to that.
Yeah, before I do, Ariana, I think you had a point you wanted to add as well, right?
Oh yeah, no, I was just going to say, when thinking about confidentiality too, and how the tool is going to use your information, and again, kind of going back to the service provider consideration of making sure you look at your service provider agreements to see if there is an AI component, how they're utilizing that. Let's say it's a CRM system, you input your client's information in there. Will they be using your client's information to help develop the tool? Is there an opt-out for that? So I think a lot of firms forget about that sometimes. It's really important to look at the service provider agreements as well.
Great.
Sorry, yeah, absolutely. And so there are obviously a number of regulatory and legal risk, and I would almost lump copyright law into that sort of legal category. For purposes of our audience here, we're going to focus more on the the compliance type risks, and those are really going to be relating to disclosure. Disclosing, what the AI tools are doing, what data they're using, what types of decisions they're making, and the extent to which your firm is actually using AI relative to what you're disclosing to the market. We'll cover on a few slides later what the SEC is focusing on when it comes to AI washing and some of these concepts. So we'll get into that in a moment. But from a legal and compliance risk, some of the things to be aware of are you using proprietary data in your searches, in your use of, particularly in generative AI? Are you using proprietary or confidential data? If so, just be aware that the data that you're putting in might be fed to somebody else when they're running queries, because the model is storing, or could potentially be storing, the data that you're inputting. So just be aware of that from both a copyright and a trade secret, investment research, any type of information that you're putting into the system. It could be retained, whether it's for 30 days, whether it's for 5 minutes, it could be used in a subsequent query. So from a compliance standpoint, though, I think the biggest issues to be aware of for this audience, are those that relate to, are you doing what you say you're doing? Are you disclosing it appropriately to your clients? Are you disclosing it appropriately to regulators? Because it's going to pose a risk that, again, under the anti-fraud statutes, are you clearly marketing your service, your advisory business, in an accurate manner? Ari, I don't know if you want to add to that in terms of any compliance.
Yeah,
AI is being used.
I'll throw in the fund CCO liability as well. You've got to make sure that you have an understanding of how AI is being used at your firm, how it's being used by service providers, that there's appropriate oversight. And this probably will lead into the governance conversation as well. But, and I'll tie it back to data accuracy, because that was something that I was concerned about with this neural network, right? If some of the data inputs going into the system were broken, that would materially impact the recommendations of the output, and then therefore the recommendations that the firm would make to clients. And so not being a tech expert, one way that I mitigated that risk was hired an expert to come in and look at that to make sure all aspects of the system were working as they should be working. And funny enough, that person was EJ. So that was about 12 years ago. And I'll tell you, the CEO who is no longer in the industry, so I feel comfortable saying that he did not like to allocate a lot of money to compliance resources. He said it was the best money he ever spent. And so I think that you can get assurances in different ways from a compliance perspective to help you as a CCO understand this stuff by looking at resources out there in the industry to help, whether it be just kind of dissecting the AI at your firm, especially for smaller firms out there that don't have the internal resources to handle it themselves.
And what about the topic of books and records? We've seen a lot of focus from the SEC on off-channel communications, on just firms not storing business records on firm systems. And this relates to a question that we just got, and I would encourage anyone in the audience to pose their questions in the chat. If advisors are using, Teams or Copilot or some other AI technology to record, meeting transcripts for client calls, for meetings with, third parties, meetings with, companies that you're considering investing in, for example, as well, are those meeting transcripts books and records that the firm needs to retain? Or would you lump them in the same category as a voicemail or something else? And I think it relates to what you were saying, Ariana, that the part of the concern is the accuracy of the data in those transcripts. AI is good, but it's not foolproof. It's not 100%. And so even if you record a client call, even if you record a client meeting, an annual client meeting to touch base on their preferences, their allocation, their risk, and so forth, are you properly checking to make sure that the transcript is accurate? And I don't know if there are any other considerations there.
Yeah, there is some risk there.
Obviously.
Consent, yes.
Yeah, consent, and also, I've seen firms that are using this for meetings with clients as well, and it automatically gets input into their CRM system or the client's file. And I always say to them, make sure you look at those records beforehand, because now this is a record of the firm that would be turned over to the SEC upon request, right? So again, can add a lot of value to the business, making it more efficient, but certainly need to make sure that if you're using these transcribe features, that you're making sure that you're capturing the records in your system. And also think about where those records are being stored. And if it's at a third party provider and not your own network or systems, think about disclosure on your Form ADB Part 1 and disclosing to the SEC that those records might be maintained by a service provider.
And I think one of the big things we've really seen as we look at risk, and we get asked a whole lot, both on the compliance side and cybersecurity side, right? What are the risks with this system? And we learned very, very quickly is that we pretty much always need to come back with that next question with, well, it depends. How are you going to use it? And as we look at those AI risks, so much of it presents, right, not just about the technology, but it's about the use case and how those things come combined. And we see that in the governance section, right? And when people are looking at this from a policy perspective,
right.
The best of breed firms that we're seeing out there aren't looking at this just approving use cases or tools, but are marrying those things together. So they're looking to say, right, this is now going to be used where, Bill, you can now use ChatGPT to do marketing reviews, right, or marketing prep.
Acceptable usage.
Right, you can use it for acceptable usage. You can use that to help, prepare information that's going out in our marketing site, but, you cannot use it to help write an employee performance review. that's going to be a different use case. And those things are really going to, vary a lot depending on where your use cases are. And we look at some of those, a few of these kinds of standards that are up here, but, it's important to consider each one of those things individually. So as we talk more before, we're talking about generalized AI tools, and the other are those more specific, right? Using systems for e-coms or marketing reviews, for enterprise research, for other types of features, right? Those meeting transcription tools. So with that, the next question here is, we're kind of curious out there where people are using those function-specific AI tools for the following. And again, I'd just like to go back to you, Bill, because you see things out there. Where do you see people on this?
Do you want me to get into governance a bit, or is this?
Well, we can go to governance. We can hop there. I mean,
Yeah. So the specific tools. It really. Certainly meeting transcription, but I think it's enterprise search is probably going to be for me it's the best use case, although email is maybe the most common use case, right? Meeting transcription, I think both EJ and Ariana kind of laid out some of the considerations there really well. What are my prompts? Am I capturing them? What's the output? Is it just transcription? Am I analyzing those transcripts? Should I be recording internal meetings? I'm too lazy to take notes, and now I've got to worry about filing those away, or is it only if it's involved in sort of an investment management process? So these things are still playing out, and I think as exam suites begin to happen in 2025, as they will, kind of best practices will emerge. But certainly these are the questions and the considerations.
Awesome. And interestingly, for this crowd, meeting transcription is the #1 use case on where it is. I think that's one of the easiest ones to set up, and we see that a lot. Interesting, not here, this crowd, not a lot of email calendar management, which
I think meeting transcription will go down when people start to consider what EJ was talking about. So, yeah.
Well, yeah, I think the other thing that I neglected to mention earlier is I've had a number of firms reach out and say, look, we had these meetings, not just with clients that we've got transcripts of, but we've had meetings with portfolio companies. We've had meetings with issuers that we're considering investing in, and some of these transcripts may or may not contain sensitive information. They may or may not contain MNPI, but even if they contain sensitive information, we necessarily want everyone at the firm to have access to. From an enterprise search standpoint, it gets back to what Bill and Jacob were discussing earlier, that segregation of some of this data is equally important. Not just having the transcripts, but where are you storing those transcripts? What are you doing with those after you have the data? Because the information that's in those transcripts could be problematic if it's seen by the wrong folks.
Yeah, I imagine everyone could listen in on everyone else's calls, and it's there forever, right?
So, yeah, that's basically it. Yeah.
So I imagine that number will go down in terms of meeting transcriptions.
Yeah. So as we look through that again, that key takeaway is understanding that risk involves both the tools and the use cases. But we're going to get into that governance side. We don't.
Yeah.
On the next side, and just leading into that is to understand what people are out there, because usually that starts with the AI policy.
Yeah, no, perfect. I thought we were asking that question, and so my mind jumped ahead before, but I won't right now. So, funny story, not hilarious, but sad. We're in the process of writing a paper on AI usage by hedge funds, and we just had our legal compliance review. So over the Thanksgiving break, guess what I was doing? I was rewriting the governance section. And I had used some hyperbole and made these bold statements about policy, which of course, this is where it's a compliance firm here, like about policy. when I asked Jacob and others, well, in practice, right? So in theory, yes. In practice, how many funds out there have an AI policy? And the answer is, at this point, it's a handful. Will it grow? Absolutely, right? But we're so early days. When Morgan Stanley asked the same question in a survey like a year ago, it was like 63% of people didn't have a policy, right? So not to jump the gun on what we're about to see here, I'm sure it's increased a little bit, but it's still early days. Okay. But governance, right, is the overarching thing. I like the concept of a committee, and if you're a hedge fund with 4 people, the committee is at least 3 of you, right? So committee is a concept, and sometimes it's an actual thing, but you really want to have a firm view on this, and we've talked about the reasons why. We've talked about how the number of firms out there saying they're not using it is probably underrepresented because you just don't know that people are using it. And we'll get into best practices, and this is Jacob's area around blacklisting sites, right, so that employees maybe can't access ChatGPT directly or Anthropic or whatever it might be. But having that committee and figuring out, so this ideal, I'll talk about the ideal scenario, right? I'm a $20 billion hedge fund with 250 people in the organization, and I've got a CTO and I've got heads of all these departments. The CTO, in conjunction with the CCO, goes out to every department head and says, hey, HR, what are some use cases? Hey, marketing and IR, what are some use cases? Hey, ops, hey, front office. Give me your use cases. And now as the technology professional, it's incumbent on me to figure out how to kind of implement solutions. And it's up to the management committee to figure out how to stage those solutions and prioritize them. And it's up to, pointing at the screen, the CCOs and the compliance function to figure out the guardrails, or help me figure out as a technologist what these guardrails need to be, right? And then maybe you talk to folks like myself and figure out what vendors are out there, or you go out and you DIY enough people to maybe you do it yourself. So that's kind of the concept of overall governance committee. Ariana talked about something very important, which is kind of testing, right? Testing the output. And there's a term that maybe didn't exist 12 years ago when you hired EJ, human in the loop, right? So you don't just take the output and stick it in the model and you're off to the races and making investments or sending things out to clients or something. So human in the loop is something that you hear a lot. It sounds like EJ was the human in that loop way back when. So that's a couple things about governance. Usage, we talked about it before. What different functions are you going to be using this for? And ultimately, you want that to make its way into the policy, right? Like any policy, you don't want to hamstring yourself necessarily, because then you're subject to potentially failure to supervise. And so the people on the call here, probably better suited to speak to that than I am. But you do what we talked about: 30-day retention policy and incognito mode, so that models aren't being trained on my data. The entitlements that we talked about is kind of important to kind of address through governance. So again, all things that we kind of hit upon before. We weren't just saving it for the end here, but all of this gets sort of codified a bit in a policy eventually. And in the absence of an official policy, having kind of this committee concept and the oversight from that perspective. And then ultimately, this is technology and the tracking of the prompts. I'll leave you with this thought. One thing that we didn't, so it's not completely repeat ourselves, something that wasn't discussed before when EJ was going through it, our prompts IP, right? If I'm a prompt engineer, right? Am I, and I leave the firm and go somewhere else, and I'm using those same prompts to generate output elsewhere? Is that the IP of the firm that I just left? So all of these are all things kind of related to governance and policy, and ultimately the regulations, the books and records that we spoke about. Capturing meetings is something to kind of take into consideration. So yeah, quite a lot there. So now I'm curious to hear what the answer will be.
Let's see where people are.
All right. Okay. Oh, incorporated in other policies. Great. Okay.
Yep. So we've got that there, but still a minority of people have a policy at this point. But I mean, this is interesting to see. The true majority know what planning and developing would suit. So I guess this is the timely time for this topic.
Yeah.
And as we look at governance, right? Some of those things of what should go in there. So, Bill, I think you hit upon a few of these things, right? That idea of the governance committee.
I was really speaking to really what the slide, some of the concepts.
And one thing on the due diligence and approval process. So
Give us the IT sort of.
yeah, well, an IT
angle,
side.
yeah.
So I think what we saw before was the evolution in the beginning, where people really trying to define up front in that policy those use cases and tools. Here's what we're going to allow. Here's what we're not going to allow, and that's going to be codified in policy.
Yeah.
We can use it for these things and not for these things. And what we've really seen is a shift as the evolution happens so quickly and there's such a variety that what we're really seeing is kind of the best in class. What they're instead doing is setting up in the policy a good framework for what is the approval process for that committee?
Right.
How are we going to log it? How are we going to look at that for that committee of looking at our use cases in our business, but also then doing cybersecurity due diligence on that vendor? Do they have those proper controls in place? Where is that data privacy going to be? And seeing that really
am I indemnified from any malfeasance on the part of the LLM if they're training their models on data that's behind a paywall, right? I mean,
right.
Vendor contracts, right?
Where those may be, right, of trying to come through, right? We're going to use that for code, where they're copyright and IP. Where is that going to happen? But what does that process look like is really going into the policies, and then we see people handling the specifics of what's allowed or not allowed outside of that. Because again, you don't want to trip yourself up or be too rigid.
Otherwise, you're subject to failure to supervise if you're not following something to a T. Yeah, great point.
Right. And doing that, and part of that is putting in those monitoring and security controls, right? So deciding what that supervision is, and a lot of that really starts. We've seen in these early days that places that don't have a policy, a lot of times people are picking their own AI tools, setting up their own accounts. It's not running through corporate IT. It's not running through corporate governance. And even if people aren't doing a lot with the monitoring and supervision yet, but starting to put that, corral it, right? So that's at least there for the future. Get everyone on a business account that's with their business email address, where employees know that they're subject to supervision. Those things might get captured someday, right?
Know what your employees are doing, right? So I don't care if we're talking about AI or whatever else. That's probably a pretty good policy. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, I think it's a good point. I think it gets back to the the old discussion of rogue IT or shadow IT. Just knowing what your staff are using. Are they using cloud-based services that you're unaware of? Well, the same concepts apply to use of AI. Are your employees using AI tools that you as a chief compliance officer or chief information officer or CEO or other title may not be aware of? And Jacob, you raised a good point that if firms aren't starting to put guardrails in place now and build, to your point about establishing a nice framework for that policy, if firms don't start reining it in now, employees are going to be making those decisions for you, and it's going to get much harder to rein in that activity. Once the cat's out of the bag, it gets a lot harder to rein it in. But if firms start thinking about it now and thinking strategically about how to approach AI, not from the standpoint of, okay, my firm's not going to use it, but start from the assumption that your firm is going to use it. Now let's figure out how to use it in a compliant manner, in a secure manner.
Yep, I like that.
Yeah,
I think most firms are using it, even if they don't realize that they are, right? Either somebody at the firm is maybe using Copilot or ChatGPT, or a service provider is. So we're going to talk about SEC exams as well. But I would not want to say to the SEC, oh, no, we don't use AI at all. I'd rather approach it saying, we have an AI acceptable use policy. We have an inventory of AI that's used at the firm. And while we don't use anything internally, we don't permit this, that, and the other. We've conducted due diligence of our service provider, and there is one that has an AI component. We have not started using that AI component, but we have looked into it. And in taking more of a proactive approach to that, adding disclosure to your ADV brochure about the risk, general risk of AI, thinking about if you start to use it, any conflicts of interest that could exist. Is the use of the AI beneficial to the firm and might not be that beneficial to the client? So thinking through that and having appropriate disclosure in the ADV, I think, are all different ways that you can approach this from the compliance perspective.
I think that's great. And the other thing I think that we'll hopefully see a big change on is the training side of this, because I think that this is something, I see a handful of clients approaching in a thoughtful way, but it's really, really the exception, is having training around AI, right? Both high level, what does it do? What are its compliance? What's our uses? But also, I think there's this interesting land between sort of what a almost semi-technical training, right? There's engineering training, right? Let's get our Python coders to really understand how they're using it. But most people really aren't doing a lot around, prompt engineering. How do you get more out of these systems and knowing where their weak spots are so people understand, right? There are things you may not intuitively get, but AI, as much as they're non-human, a lot of these models are people pleasers. If you bang away at the same model, asking it the same question again and again and again, a lot of them will eventually give you the answer, things you want to hear, for people to understand those kinds of limitations.
Guilty of done that. But policy testing, right? I mean, those are all key aspects of governance.
Yep. And then, Ariana, you hit on some of this stuff right before, but, that other element, right? This is now a priority for the SEC.
Yeah, if we could take 5 minutes on this and then a couple minutes for questions, I think that's great. Yeah. Doing well.
Okay, so I'll cover a couple. I talked about AI washing in general and just, not being misleading, not being fraudulent. And I just wanted to, read a quote from outgoing SEC Chair Gary Gensler that really talks about this topic, because AI is obviously the sexy new buzzword. A lot of firms are now, suddenly hanging up a shingle saying that they're AI firms. Chair Gensler said that investment advisors or broker-dealers should not mislead the public by saying that they are using an AI model when they're not, nor say that they're using an AI model in a particular way, but not do so. And I think that really summarizes the SEC's approach to the use of AI. Ariana, I know that we've seen some enforcement actions. We've seen some investor alerts. I mean, the SEC is all over this.
Yeah, and they gave a shout out to it in the 2025 exam priorities. So that was a first. So I think they're doing actually a service to the industry, saying, we're putting you on alert. We're going to ask about this. And so, ties back into governance. You want to go ahead and start being proactive. And certainly if you're using it, you want to make sure that your marketing of how you're using it is in line with actually how it's being used. This was something that made me, I was a nervous wreck. It made me very nervous when I worked at this firm that was using the neural network, because it was heavily marketed. And we spent a lot of money with outside counsel to develop comprehensive disclosures. But, a lot of times the marketing folks really wanted to push the envelope, and I'd have to, kind of rein them in and help them understand that, the SEC's focus of not having misleading marketing of the tool is important. So, just making sure you've got appropriate disclosures and any marketing of it is fair and balanced, I think is important. Can I just add too, I went through cybersecurity exam sweep at this firm. We were one of the first 50 firms that got hit with the sweep. I think it was like 2014 or 2015. And the AI got brought up in that examination. And even at that time, the SEC, after I explained it to them, there was no follow-up questions. They did not understand it. And so I share that with you because while the SEC has started hiring experts in DC that understand AI, and certainly we might start seeing sweeps that are conducted out of Washington by these experts, if it's a routine exam, the exam team that's in your office might not understand it. So making sure you can clearly articulate how you're using it or your process in plain English, I think will go far with them. A lot of the examiners are learning with us, I'll just say. So although it's overwhelming for compliance professionals, just remember that, the SEC is learning with the industry.
Great point. I think with that, we are towards the end of this and coming in well on time. So, I just open it up. I don't know if anyone out there has any questions, please feel free to put them in the chat, or if any of my co-panelists have anything else you'd like to wrap up with. We do have a question. Again, this is, about the, related to, going back to those meeting transcripts. And really, how do we make sure that we're validating for, if there are mistakes in those, and those are becoming business records, right? So, EJ and Ariana, I think you touched on this before, that you have to check, and those things might be there and there are mistakes, but what action should someone take, right? If they do notice something that maybe seems like a mistake, or something that they don't necessarily aren't thrilled about memorializing, what should people do about it?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think like I said, when it comes to transcripts, I think the jury's still out in terms of whether or not a transcript of a client meeting is a book and record that the firm needs to maintain. I think you could say it's analogous to a voicemail. You could say it's analogous to just handwritten notes during the client meeting, or you could say it's like an email. And I think depending on how you interpret it, probably plays into how your firm addresses that risk. Like anything, I would say analyze the transcript. If you're recording transcripts, and obviously to Bill's point, make sure that you get consent before recording, because that's really how a lot of these transcription technologies work. Once you have consent, once you have the transcript, go through it, analyze it. Have that human in the loop to analyze for accuracy. Analyze to make sure that nothing inaccurate is in there, that more sensitive was disclosed that perhaps shouldn't, particularly if you're just posting this transcript somewhere on your open network, accessible to everybody at your firm. You really want to know what's in there and know what the subsequent use cases might be of that data. But I would go a step further. Look, if you have a transcript of a client call and the client has mentioned in that call, look, I want to change my investment recommendations. I want to change this stock to that stock. I want to invest in this and not that. Or, hey, I'm going to need some additional liquidity soon. We're buying a house. If your transcript is the only record of that, I would say, transcripts are not 100% reliable. I would much prefer to say, take that transcript, summarize it in an email that you write, maybe use ChatGPT to help you write it, but summarize it in an email or a form or an attestation, put that in front of the client and say, look, just to summarize what we've discussed, you want to change your investment allocation as such, please sign below. Evidence it that way. That's my recommendation.
I think the type of transcript matters. To
Right.
your point, with a client, is it with a company you might invest in, or is it an internal meeting about some policy, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
And if there's a glaring error, documentation is key, right? Having some sort of documentation, and there's been some review of it, and that somebody misspoke and that was not the intent. I think that is something that a step I would take as well, and keep that in the file with the transcription.
Great.
Great practical advice, and takes us right to the end of our hour. So thank you, everyone out there in the audience, and my fellow panelists here today. And just want to let you know we've got another webinar coming up. Our next one also with Ariana.
Can't wait. Get ready for your ADV filing.
Right, that's the
January 23rd.
Nothing's better than ADV filing. No, I'm sure it will actually be a very good one on this element, and timely as we hit the springtime season. All right. Well, thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.